souls and set them on fire. Amen. Well, we are at a turning point in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, we're right at the very midpoint of the Gospel. It's kind of a climactic moment, a watershed moment. If the Gospel of Mark were like a hinge, today's episode would be the linchpin that held the two halves together. And it begins with Jesus and his disciples going on retreat, leaving Galilee, heading north, up into the region of Caesarea Philippi. In other words, deep into Gentile territory. And while they are on their way, Jesus poses a question. Who do people say that I am? Now just say that's the question that has been being asked, that's been hovering in the narrative ever since the beginning of the Gospel. Now see, we as readers of the Gospel, we have some insight that characters don't, because we know who Jesus is. The very first verse told us. Mark begins his Gospel by saying, the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And we were there. We heard the voice out of heaven at Jesus' baptism, calling him the beloved Son. But none of the other characters in the Gospel were given these bits of insight. They have to figure this out on their own. They have to look at what Jesus is saying and doing and put the pieces together to try and figure out who he is. And so there's this dramatic tension because we have the secret. We have the answer. And we're waiting for characters in the gospel to come to the same conclusion. After Jesus' very first exorcism, his first miracle in the gospel, so on the Sabbath, he exorcises this demon. The people are astounded. And they say, what is this? A new teaching. He even commands unclean spirits, and they obey him. And then when Jesus forgives the sins of a paralytic and heals him, the Pharisees ask the question, who is this? Who does he think he is? Only God can forgive sins. And then the disciples get in on this act of asking questions. After their first sea crossing with Jesus, where there's this big storm that terrifies them, and they wake him up, and he rebukes this wind and the waves, and it all calms down. They're astounded. They say to one another, who is this then, that even the wind and the waves obey him? So these questions that are asked in the gospel of who is this Jesus, they just hang in the narrative. And we wait for an answer. And finally, the answer comes today. Who do people say that I am? And his disciples say, well, John the Baptist. Some think you're Elijah. Some think you're one of the prophets of old. But who do you say that I am? Peter steps forward and, speaking on behalf of the disciples, said, you are the Messiah. And if you've been reading along with Mark, you're like, finally. We've been waiting for this for 8 chapters. And you want to sit there and kind of rest a little bit. Just kind of bask in the glory that they finally got it. But the moment that Peter utters these words, you are the Messiah, Jesus says, and don't tell anybody. And then everything changes. Everything changes. The gospel is completely different from this point forward. Once the disciples finally recognize who Jesus is, it all changes. In the first half of the gospel, Jesus is running around performing mighty deeds, speaking mighty words. There are 15 exorcisms, healings, feedings, 15 miracles in the first half of Mark, and 2 summary statements about crowds of people coming to Jesus for healing. After this point, 3. And in the place of the healings, Jesus begins to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the chief priests and elders, and be killed, and on the third day rise again. And notice it says that he spoke this all quite openly, all quite plainly. In other words, he's not speaking in parables anymore. This is straight, unadorned, non-metaphorical speech. The Son of Man must die. Well, Peter's not going to have any of this. So Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. And it's very fascinating. Peter, in one breath, says, "You are the Messiah." And in the very next breath, "You are crazy." He rebukes him. Who gets rebuked in the gospel? Demons, unclean spirits. It's almost as if Peter is saying, "You have an unclean spirit in you." Well, Jesus turns his back on Peter, looking at the rest of the disciples, says, "Get behind me, Satan. Because you are thinking the things of men, the things of people, not the things of God. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. You're not viewing any of this from God's perspective or from the perspective of the kingdom, but from just your own limited human perspective." And so then, he calls the crowds together, and he says, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." It's more crazy talk. Lose your life so that you can save it. See, this moment, when Jesus is finally identified as the Messiah, which is clearly based upon all of these wonderful things that he was doing, it wasn't enough. The question now becomes, what kind of Messiah? What will I do with my power? And so Jesus, not only today, but he'll do it 2 other times, as they begin to make their way to Jerusalem, Jesus will begin to teach his disciples not only about his own suffering, but what it's going to mean to be with this Jesus who was essentially a dead man walking. If the Messiah is carrying a cross, then those who want to be with him will also have to carry a cross. And the question is for us, as it was for the disciples, what does it mean to deny ourselves? What does it mean to take up our cross? What does it mean to lose our lives for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of the gospel? It's a simple answer. I mean, it just basically means you gotta die, right? That's simple. But what does that look like in real life? And this is really the question that's going to be playing out, that's going to be answered over the next several weeks as we follow Jesus and the disciples as they make their way to Jerusalem. He's going to try to teach his disciples what it means to deny themselves, to take up their cross, to be with him in this way. And I expect that some of the answers that the gospel gives will be true for everybody, that there's some general things that will connect with all of us. But I also think that denying ourselves and taking up our cross, there are going to be elements of how that is in our life that are unique to us. And so I want to tell you a story of someone who denied himself, took up his cross, someone who had a watershed moment in his life because he wanted to be with Jesus. And I expect some of you have heard of him. His name's Henry Allen. Written lots of books. He was a Catholic priest. He passed away in 1996, but he was a Catholic priest. He was Dutch, but he lived in the United States and in Canada for a long time. He was an academic for 20 years, teaching pastoral theology, pastoral psychology, Christian spirituality. And after 20 years in the academy, he began to find that even though on the outside everything seemed to be going well for him, on the inside he was experiencing a sustained spiritual burnout. He said, everybody was telling me I was doing a good job. Everything I was doing really well. But something inside me was telling me that my success was putting my own soul in danger. So he begins to pray, Lord, show me where you want me to go, and I will follow you. And so the Lord told Henry, go and live among the poor in spirit, and they will heal you. And what this meant for Henry is that he left Harvard, and he moved to a community in Canada called the Blakley community. It is a community for severely handicapped adults. So severe that many of those who live in this community require at least 4 or 5, maybe 6 other able-bodied people just to exist. And so Henry talks about this move. He says, I moved from Harvard to L'arche, from the best and the brightest, wanting to rule the world, to men and women who had few or no words, and were considered at best marginal to the needs of our society. It was a very hard and painful move. After 20 years of being free to go where I wanted, and to discuss what I chose, the small hidden life with people whose broken minds and bodies demand a strict daily routine in which words are the least requirement, does not immediately appear as the solution for spiritual burnout. So he denied himself. He let go of a life in which he had constructed himself, constructed through his teaching, constructed through his words, constructed through his own successes. And he went to a place where none of that mattered. He said, the first thing that struck me when I came to live in a house with mentally handicapped people was that their liking or disliking me had absolutely nothing with the many useful things I had done until then. Since nobody could read my books, the books could not impress anyone. And since most of them never went to school, my 20 years at Notre Dame, Yale, and Harvard did not provide a significant introduction. My considerable ecumenical experience proved even less valuable. When I offered some meat to one of the assistants during dinner, one of the handicapped men said to me, don't give him meat. He doesn't eat meat. He's a Presbyterian. Not being able to use any of the skills that had proved so practical in the past was a real source of anxiety. I was suddenly faced with my naked self, open for affirmations and rejections, hugs and punches, smiles and tears, all dependent simply on how I was perceived at the moment. In a way, it seemed as though I was starting my life all over again. Relationships, connections, reputations could no longer be counted on. This experience was, and in many ways, is still the most important experience of my new life, because it forced me to rediscover my true identity. These broken, wounded, and completely unpretentious people forced me to let go of my relevant self. The self that can do things, show things, prove things, build things. And it forced me to reclaim that unadorned self in which I am completely vulnerable, open to receive and give love regardless of any accomplishments. I'm telling you all of this because I am deeply convinced that the Christian of the future is called to be completely irrelevant and to stand in this world with nothing to offer but his or her own vulnerable self. That is the way Jesus came to reveal God's love. And the great message that we have to carry as followers of Jesus is that God loves us not because of what we do or accomplish, but because God has created and redeemed us in love and has chosen to proclaim that love as the true source of all human life. I think for Henry Nouwen, what it would mean to deny ourselves, what it would mean to take up our cross and follow Jesus, means that we are putting our weaknesses in service of Jesus. You see, we construct a self out of what we're able to accomplish, out of what we're able to do, and we project that self to the world, hoping that the world will accept and love us. We are always, in the words of Brene Brown, hustling for our worthiness. So when Jesus talks about denying ourselves and taking up our cross, I don't think it's our true self that we are to deny. I think it's this falsely constructed self that we are called to deny. And that is death. In a world that values competence, in a world that values success, in a world that values people who have it all together, in a world that desires relevance, to become irrelevant, to become hidden, to let go of this self that we have constructed for others, to let go of this life, to lose it, is death. And it's not just death once, it's death every day. And that's what Henry experienced. But why would Jesus have us do this? Because on the other side of this death is life. Real, abundant, authentic life. So he says, lose your life so that you can save it. Forget the self that you have created and receive from God the self that you have had from the moment you existed. Because this self you won't have to cling to. This self you can give away because it's a gift to you. This, I think, is something of what it means to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, and to follow. It's not easy. Dying is not easy. But Jesus promises